didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the parking lot of the shelter, holding my son's hand while he asked me if we were going to stay in the big building again tonight. And I told him yes. And he nodded like that was a perfectly normal thing, because by then, to him, it was. Noah was 7. He'd started calling the shelter the quiet place, because there was a rule about noise after 8 o'clock. He didn't complain about it. That's the part that broke me every single night. Not that he complained, but that he didn't. I was 31 years old. I had a nursing license. I worked 32 hours a week at a pediatric clinic in Indianapolis because that was the maximum they'd give me as a part-time hire. And full-time positions had a 6-month wait list. My take-home was just under $2,000 a month. Rent for a 1-bedroom in any neighborhood close enough to Noah's school was $1,400 minimum. That left nothing for the deposit. Nothing for the first and last. Nothing for the gap between leaving somewhere and arriving somewhere else. I'd done the math 40 times. It always came out the same. What I hadn't done, what I didn't know I needed to do, was check what my grandfather had left behind. My grandfather died 14 months before all of this. He was 83, sharp until the end, a retired electrician from Fort Wayne who'd spent 40 years buying and fixing up small rental properties because, as he always said, a house doesn't call in sick. He had 4 of them by the time he died. I knew about them vaguely the way you know about things in families. Mentioned at holidays, never in detail. His name was Bernard. Everyone called him Pop. I was close to him. Closer than anyone else in the family, I thought. He used to call me on Sunday afternoons just to talk. After my divorce, when Noah's father moved to Phoenix and started a new life that included very little room for a son in Indiana, it was my grandfather who called twice a week. It was my grandfather who mailed Noah a birthday card with a $20 bill and a hand-drawn map of the solar system, because Noah was going through a space phase. When he died, my mother called me on a Tuesday morning. I drove to Fort Wayne for the funeral. I hugged my aunt. I sat in the 3rd pew and held Noah's hand and thought about Sunday phone calls and birthday cards with hand-drawn planets. What I didn't think about, because no one told me to think about it, was the will. My mother told me later that she'd spoken with the estate attorney. She said everything was being handled. She said there wasn't much, just the house my grandfather had lived in, which would be sold to cover medical bills and funeral costs, and a few accounts that would go to her and my aunt. She said it in the tone she used when she didn't want to be questioned. I didn't question her. That was my mistake. The first one. By the following spring, I was at the shelter. The clinic had reduced my hours during a budget restructuring. Noah's father was 3 months behind on child support. Not for the first time, and the legal process to do anything about that was slow and expensive in ways I couldn't afford. My landlord had sold the building. New owners wanted to renovate. I had 60 days. I found the family shelter online at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. It had a waiting list, but they'd had a cancellation. I packed what fit in my car. I told Noah we were going on an adventure. He believed me for about 2 weeks. After that, he just called it the quiet place and kept his shoes by his cot. Because another kid had told him you kept your shoes close, and he had absorbed this information with the calm practicality of a child who has learned to adapt. I adapted too. I learned which nights the donations came in and what time the showers were least crowded. I kept our important documents in a zipper pouch I wore under my scrubs when I went to work. I made Noah's lunch every morning at 5:15 so I could drop him at school by 7 and be at the clinic by 7:30. I did not tell anyone at work. I did not tell my mother. I don't know what I thought telling them would accomplish. It was a Wednesday afternoon in March. I'd picked Noah up from school and we'd stopped at the library the way we sometimes did, because the library was warm and had good light, and Noah liked the science section. He was sitting on the floor between 2 shelves reading a book about deep-sea creatures when a woman sat down in the chair at the table behind me. I noticed her the way you notice people without meaning to. Silver hair pulled back, a good coat, reading glasses on a chain. She was flipping through something on her phone. Then she looked up and looked at me the way people look at you when they think they recognize you but aren't certain. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Bernard Calloway's granddaughter?" I turned around fully. "Yes," I said. "I'm Wren." And then I stopped, because I hadn't heard my grandfather's full name spoken out loud since the funeral, and it hit me in a strange place. She took off her reading glasses. "I'm Miriam. I was your grandfather's neighbor on Ashford Court for about 12 years. He talked about you." She said it simply. No performance in it. "He talked about you." We spoke for a few minutes about him, about Fort Wayne, about how long it had been. At some point, Noah appeared from behind the shelf with his sea creature book, and she smiled at him the way older women smile at children they find interesting. Then she said, "Are you still living in his house?" "The one on Ashford Court." I looked at her. "I'm sorry. The house he left you," she said. "The one on the corner," I assumed. "Well, I haven't seen you there, so I thought maybe you were renting it out." The library was quiet. I could hear Noah turning a page. "He didn't leave me a house," I said. Miriam looked at me the way people look at you when two pieces of information they both believe to be true suddenly refuse to fit together. "He did," she said carefully. "He told me himself. He changed his trust documents about 2 years before he passed. He was very clear about it," he said. "The house on Ashford Court was going to his granddaughter and her boy." I don't remember exactly what I said next. I think I said something like, "I didn't know that." I think she could see from my face that something was wrong, because her expression shifted from confusion to something more careful. She opened her phone and found something. She showed me an address. "That's the property," she said. "There's a family in it now. Been there since last spring, I think. I assumed you'd arranged it." I did the math without meaning to. Last spring, about 2 months after my grandfather died. About 6 weeks after my mother told me the estate was being handled. I didn't confront anyone that night. I went back to the shelter, made Noah dinner from what we had, and sat on my cot after he fell asleep and thought about what Miriam had said. I turned it over and over the way you do when you're trying to find the explanation that makes sense before you have to face the one that doesn't. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she'd misunderstood. Maybe my grandfather had changed his mind. I called the county recorder's office the next morning from my car in the clinic parking lot. It took 20 minutes on hold, and then a clerk read me what was in the system. My grandfather had established a living trust 11 years ago. He'd amended it 26 months before his death. The amendment named me, my full legal name, as the sole beneficiary of the property at 4 Ashford Court, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Assessed value at time of last appraisal, $214,000. The trust had been administered by my mother as successor trustee. I sat in my car for a long time after that. The clinic opened at 8. My first patient was at 8:15. I went inside and did my job because that was what there was to do. I called an attorney that week. A friend from nursing school had gone through a custody dispute and given me a name. A woman named Gretchen, who worked out of a small office near Broad Ripple, and was, according to my friend, the kind of lawyer who doesn't blink at anything. I told Gretchen everything. She didn't blink. "How long has there been a tenant in the property?" she asked. "About 13 months, I said, based on what Miriam had told me. "Do you know the rental rate for that area?" I looked it up while we were talking. The neighborhood on Ashford Court had houses renting between $1,400 and $1,800 a month. Gretchen wrote something down. "And your mother has been collecting that rent as successor trustee," she said, not quite as a question. "I believe so," I said. "And you never received any of it?" "No." "And you were living in a shelter?" Said yes. She was quiet for a moment in the way that wasn't actually quiet, the way that meant she was thinking about several things at once. "I need to see the trust documents," she said. "And I need to see what accounts the rental income was deposited into." The trust documents were on file with the county. Getting the bank records took longer, but Gretchen was methodical, and she knew exactly what she was looking for. What she found was this: 13 months of rental income, deposited into an account in my mother's name. Not a trust account, not an escrow account. A personal checking account, approximately $22,000 in rent, that should have been held in trust or transferred to me, the beneficiary. There was also the matter of a home equity line of credit that had been opened against the property 8 months ago. The line of credit was in the trust's name, which meant my mother had signed for it as trustee. She'd drawn $11,000 from it, $33,000. Roughly. Give or take. Gretchen set down her pen. This is breach of fiduciary duty, she said. At minimum. Depending on how the DA looks at it, it may also be theft and fraud. I nodded. How is your relationship with your mother? She asked. I thought about that. I thought about all the Sundays she hadn't called. I thought about the funeral, the way she'd told me the estate was being handled with that particular tone that meant don't ask. I thought about Noah in the quiet place keeping his shoes by his cot. Distant, I said. Gretchen sent a formal letter to my mother. It was specific. It named the trust documents, the rental income, the line of credit, the dates, the amounts. It said I was the rightful beneficiary and that all assets and accounting needed to be transferred to me within 30 days, or we would be pursuing legal action. My mother called me 3 hours after it arrived. I let it go to voicemail. She called twice more that evening. My aunt called. My mother's younger sister, a woman I'd always found slightly more honest than the rest, called and said she didn't know, she hadn't known, please call back. I let all of them go to voicemail. What I did instead was focus on what Gretchen needed from me, and on the tenant in the house on Ashford Court, and on the question of what came next. The tenant was a young couple. They'd been renting through a property management company my mother had apparently hired. They didn't know there was anything unusual about the arrangement. When the property management company received a letter from Gretchen indicating the trust ownership situation and requesting records, they cooperated quickly. They'd been depositing rent to an account number they'd been given. The account was my mother's. My mother's name is Harriet. I don't think I've said that yet. She's 64 years old. She worked in insurance for 30 years and retired early. She has a nice house in Carmel, the suburb north of Indianapolis, where the school ratings are high and the grocery stores have wider aisles. My brother lives with her. He's 36, between jobs in the way he's been, between jobs for most of his adult life, living on the ground floor of her house and driving a truck she helped him buy last year. I don't say this to make her sound monstrous. I say it because context matters. She had 2 children. One of them needed help and had a good reason to ask for it. One of them needed help and had inherited a house that wasn't his. She chose to give the house to neither of us. She chose to keep the money herself. That's the part I've thought about most. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than anger. Something that sits in your chest and doesn't move. The legal process took 4 months from Gretchen's first letter to the resolution. My mother did not contest the trust documents. She couldn't. They were clear, and my grandfather's attorney had copies of the amendment signed and notarized. What she did instead was hire her own attorney and spend 6 weeks suggesting various arrangements that would have given me the property but excused the rental income and the line of credit as estate management fees and maintenance costs. Gretchen did not agree to any of them. In the end, my mother repaid $22,000 in rental income plus the $11,000 from the line of credit. She signed documents closing the line of credit and returning the account to clear. The property transferred to me through proper trust distribution. The tenants were given appropriate notice and moved out amicably. They'd been planning to buy anyway and actually thanked me in a note they left on the kitchen counter. There was no criminal prosecution. Gretchen had warned me that was likely, that the DA's office in that county was understaffed, and this kind of civil matter rarely rose to their priority list unless the amounts were significantly larger. I accepted that. I'm not sure I had the energy for more. My mother and I have not spoken since. I don't know if that's permanent. I think about it sometimes. Not with the hope of reconciliation, exactly, but with the kind of open-endedness that comes from not knowing what you want something to become. What I do know is this. The house on Ashford Court has 3 bedrooms. The kitchen faces east and gets morning light. There's a yard with a tree in it that needs some work, but not much. Noah has a room that is his, entirely his, with space for his books and his models of the solar system and his shoes placed neatly by the door, because some habits take a while to unlearn. I took possession of the house on a Thursday. It was late October, cold and gray in the way that Fort Wayne gets in fall, and I drove up and sat outside for a few minutes before I went in. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe just a moment to let it be real. Noah was in school. I had 2 hours before pickup. I went inside alone. The couple had left it clean, cleaner than I'd expected. There were marks on the wall in the hallway where they'd hung pictures. There were 3 hooks by the back door. The kitchen smelled like nothing in particular, which is what a room smells like when it's waiting for someone to fill it. I walked through every room. I stood at the window, in what would be my bedroom, and looked at the backyard and thought about my grandfather calling me on Sunday afternoons. I thought about birthday cards with hand-drawn planets. I thought about what it means to leave something for someone's. To decide, deliberately, that this thing should go to this person. He'd known. He'd known I might need it. He'd amended the trust 2 years before he died, which means he'd thought about it, he'd made a decision, he'd signed his name. He just hadn't known his decision would need to survive my mother. I stood there in the quiet of the empty house, and I didn't say anything out loud. There wasn't anyone to say it to, but I thought, I'm here, Pop. I found it. It took longer than you probably planned, but I'm here. I told Noah about the house that afternoon when I picked him up from school. I told him we were moving to Fort Wayne. I told him we had a house, a real one, with a yard. He thought about this for about 30 seconds. Does it have a good library nearby? He asked. I said I'd find out. He said okay. That night, back at the shelter for the last 2 weeks before I could move in, he placed his shoes by his cot the way he always did. But when I turned off the light, he said, Mom? I said yes. In the new house, he said, I don't have to keep my shoes by the bed. No, I said. You don't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to put them in the closet. That sounds right, I said. He fell asleep before I did. He usually does. I lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the shelter, the low hum of the building, someone coughing 2 rows over, the muffled voice of a staff member in the hallway, and I thought about closets. About having a closet. About the particular luxury of a place where you put your shoes at night, because you know exactly where you'll be in the morning. I didn't cry that night either. I'd been saving it, I think, without meaning to. I waited until we pulled into the driveway on Ashford Court the first morning it was ours. Noah got out of the car and immediately started examining the tree in the front yard. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment and looked at the house. My grandfather's house, his corners, and his roof, and his east-facing kitchen, and then I let go of whatever I'd been holding on to for the past 14 months, just for a minute. Then I got out of the car, because there were boxes to unload and a boy to feed, and a life to start, and the house was waiting, and it had already waited long enough.